All right, let's jump right into this fast-paced explainer breaking down the insanely high-stakes May 2026 summit between the United States and China. When the leaders of the world's two largest economies sit down in the same room, literally the entire globe is watching. But this was absolutely not your standard diplomatic check-in. The meetings in Beijing's Great Hall of the People were supposed to cool down economic tensions, but as we're going to see, the massive undercurrents of military rivalry, proxy wars, and supply chain battles completely took over. It was easily one of the most intense geopolitical showdowns we've seen in recent memory.
Now, before they even had a chance to get into the weeds of, say, trade agreements or tariffs, Chinese President Xi Jinping set a deeply serious tone right out of the gate. He actually leaned on a concept rooted way back in ancient Greek history to outline the immense risks of the current U.S.-China dynamic. He essentially warned that any mishandling of this relationship could lead to a really, really dangerous situation for everyone.
Section 1. The Beijing Summit and the Thucydides Trap.
So, skipping right past the usual pleasantries, the red carpet ceremonies and military honor guards, Xi immediately drops this concept called the Thucydides Trap. If you're not familiar with it, it's a concept popularized by political scientists, basically looking back at the historian Thucydides' observation of how a rising Athens totally frightened established Sparta, which eventually caused the Peloponnesian War. By bringing this up, Xi was clearly framing China as the rising power and America as this fearful, established hegemon. It was a very pointed warning to the U.S., basically saying, do not interfere with Chinese ambitions because failing to respect China's red lines could lead to an absolute catastrophe.
And going right into the Great Hall of the People, you could see this massive clash of priorities, just wildly different agendas. On the U.S. side, the urgent focus was entirely on the Middle East. President Trump came into that meeting really needing Xi's help to broker an end to the costly war in Iran, mostly because Tehran relies so heavily on China for its economic survival. But over on the China side, Beijing was laser-focused on its own primary objective, the Taiwan Strait. China's clear goal for the summit was to weaken the U.S. commitment to Taiwan, which of course Beijing considers a self-governing democracy that just has to be brought under its control.
Which brings us right to Section 2.
The Taiwan Flashpoint.
Listen to this visceral quote from Xi. He literally said, Taiwan independence and cross-strait peace are as irreconcilable as fire and water. I mean, wow. That leaves virtually zero room for compromise, and it directly challenges long-standing U.S. policy in the region. Xi did say that safeguarding peace across the strait is the biggest common denominator between the two countries, but his rhetoric lays down a really stark boundary. And at the time of the meetings, reports showed President Trump didn't publicly respond to this specific statement, which honestly just highlights exactly how delicate this whole diplomatic tightrope truly is.
Now, to understand why you should even care about an island 6,000 miles away from the U.S. mainland, just look at this staggering number, 99%. That is how many advanced AI chips Taiwan currently produces, 99. In our tech-driven world, these highly specialized chips are essentially the oil of the 21st century. Without them, your smart devices, major corporate servers, all these future AI technologies, they basically just become really expensive paperweights. Experts like historian Ag Freiman point out in his book, Defending Taiwan, that losing access to these chips wouldn't just be a hiccup. It would trigger a global economic crisis far, far worse than the 2008 recession. Freiman argues that a confrontation in the street would just completely restructure the global economy. But actually, it's not just about the chips. He notes that Taiwan's strategic position on the map physically prevents China from dominating the Pacific all the way to Hawaii.
Meanwhile, Beijing isn't just waiting around. They are actively using these gray zone tactics to slowly alter the status quo, but doing it in a way that doesn't give the U.S. clear grounds to step in militarily. They're normalizing a constant military and Coast Guard presence, flying regular sorties right across the street's median line, and using their massive resources to wage an information war. It's this calculated strategy designed to divide the Taiwanese public and just inch closer to control, all without firing a single shot that might trigger a massive U.S. response.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, the Tech and Trade War.
So while all the flashy headlines focus on the military posturing, the underlying war is actually being fought on corporate balance sheets. Sure, the summit formally touched on extending trade truces, maybe some agricultural purchases, and aerospace agreements, but the reality? It's a fierce, cutthroat race for technological supremacy and self-sufficiency. Neither side wants to rely on the other for the critical hardware that's going to power the next generation of computing and AI.
Get this. Operating expenses for China's biggest chip foundry, SMIC, climbed a massive 30% year over year in their latest quarter alone.
That huge spike in spending is no accident, right? It proves that Beijing is aggressively pushing to overcome U.S. export curbs and localize their own chip production with absolute urgency. They are throwing vast amounts of money at becoming technologically self-sufficient.
And on the flip side, look at how the rest of the market is reacting to all this. Companies like Foxconn, which are traditionally anchored in Asia, are now expanding their AI server production footprint right here in the US to be closer to American customers like NVIDIA and just to manage their geopolitical risks. But even as that happens, traditional US exporters are feeling the squeeze. Take Boeing, for instance. We saw their shares drop as investors increasingly doubt that those long-awaited, massive jet orders from Beijing will ever actually happen. We are literally watching global economic decoupling happen in real time.
And finally, Section 4, the Iran proxy conflict. Let's zoom out to the shadow war playing out in the Middle East. According to the Pentagon, the U.S. has already spent a mind-boggling $29 billion in Iran. That kind of money puts incredible pressure on the defense budget, which creates this immense, urgent need to cut off Tehran's economic lifelines. And guess where Tehran's primary economic lifeline leads? You guessed it, China.
So in this incredibly bold opening move, right before the summit even started, the U.S. Treasury launched what analysts are calling Operation Economic Fury. They explicitly targeted and sanctioned 4 Hong Kong traders to disrupt a flow of cash that is keeping Iran's military operations afloat. These companies were slapped with penalties for selling oil to China on behalf of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It was a very direct signal to Xi Jinping that Washington is absolutely serious about shutting down those revenue streams connecting Beijing and Tehran.
So as we process all these rapid-fire developments, from the tension in the Taiwan Strait to the tech sector decoupling and the proxy conflict in the Middle East, we're left with one really critical question about the future. Can the U.S. and China actually navigate these incredible flashpoints without falling into that Thucydides trap? Or is a massive clash between the established power and the rising power just inevitable at this point? How they manage this delicate balancing act is going to dictate the entire trajectory of our global economy and security for decades to come. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and definitely keep your eyes on how these historical forces continue to unfold.